So I've been working really hard on post-labor economics. If you've been following along, then you know that my book is presently in Kickstarter format and it's going really well. However, there is another dimension to post-labor economics, and that is life after labor. What many of you have been asking for and talking about and saying, we need a meaning structure. And as always, the criticisms and complaints, the gaps that I have not yet filled is where the most interesting stuff is. This happened with post-labor economics. Whenever I was talking about supply side stuff and you guys were like, Dave, talk about demand. Likewise, while many of you, and I'm not saying all, but enough of you have accepted and said, okay, you've convinced me we can probably finance household income. You know, you've adopted the idea of the three bucket model where household income is derived from wages, capital, and transfers. And you're like, okay, cool. We can build universal high income. We can build a capital-based economic model. But what about the meaning? And at first, as always, I was like, you people are being silly. This is for you to figure out. It's not for the state to figure out. You'll figure out the meaning stuff. But the more I looked, the more interesting it became. What I've landed on and what we're going to talk about in today's video is this concept of the assumption of the indispensability of labor, AIL. So if you hear me say AIL, that's AIL, so the assumption of indispensability of labor, just because it's a mouthful. I might just call it the assumption of indispensability. But anyways, throughout all of human history, there has been a requirement for human labor. And it basically comes down to the fact that humans have three basic things that we do that our body offers. So we have sensors, which is your eyes and ears and your touch and everything else. Then you have processing, which is your brain. So that's problem solving, memory, learning, that sort of thing. And then you have actuators, which is your hands, your actual output, and your voice, your ability to put information and modify the environment around you. Now, there's other components to it, there, like energy, but those are the three primary food groups of what gives us economic utility. And until now, there was no substitute for humans. Humans themselves are fungible, meaning that okay, if you have two humans that are trained in, astrophysics, they can more or less do the same thing. Or if you have two humans that are trained to use a CNC machine and a lathe and a drill press, they can more or less make the same things, a certified machinist. But humanity was not fungible. Humanity was irreplaceable, meaning that if you wanted to build a pyramid or a dam, or if you wanted to send people to the moon, there was literally no other species, no other being on Earth or in existence that could do those things, meaning we were irreplaceable. So that is the AIL. That is the assumption of indispensability of labor. Now, from an economic perspective, that is, simple enough, straightforward enough. But there are metaphysical and ontological concerns that come with this because, and we'll get into this in a minute, but I want to give you a preview as to what all we're going to talk about in this video, is that when you don't have a objective use or purpose to the people around you, to the divinity, then you lose your place in the cosmic hierarchy. That is really what's happening and what people are afraid of. It's not just a matter of, I don't want to be useless to my family or I don't want to be useless to society. That is it. But there is an ontological shock. There is ontological vertigo that comes with it, and it is rooted in our cosmology, our mysticism, our religion, and our philosophy. So let's unpack it. Now, before we proceed, I am going to try something a little bit different with this video. So I have access to Notebook LM, and since I have a pro subscription, Notebook LM generates their cinematic version of the videos today. And so this is basically like an animated explainer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these animated explainers interspersed throughout me talking to you. So let's get into the first one where we talk about the economic side of the assumption of indispensability of labor. There we go. It's a mouthful. All right, let's get into it.
Modern economic planning operates on a silent, unquestioned premise, the assumption of indispensability. It is the belief that human labor will always be an essential physical requirement to generate economic output. Entire societal structures rely on this continuing to be true. Income taxes, payroll taxes, Social Security, and Medicare are entirely funded by the continuous extraction of value from human wages. If labor is removed from production, the primary mechanism for funding the state evaporates. This diagram illustrates the circular flow of income. Households sell their time and effort to firms. Firms pay wages to those households. Households then use those wages to purchase goods and services back from the firms. The loop sustains the economy. But from a strict physics and engineering perspective, human workers are simply biological sensors and processors. We use eyes to process visual data, brains to compute logic, and hands as actuators to manipulate physical objects. Capital, in the form of artificial intelligence and robotics, is rapidly acquiring these exact capabilities. Capitalism requires a market for goods and services to clear. It does not mathematically require a market for labor. To understand the structural crisis approaching the global economy, we have to discard the traditional concept of a job and examine the microscopic mathematics of how a firm actually values a human being. Firms possess zero intrinsic demand for human presence. A business does not hire a person because it desires a human on the premises. It hires a person to achieve a specific transformation, turning raw materials into a finished product or raw data into a tax return. Human labor is strictly a derived demand. This inequality represents the hiring calculus known as the marginal revenue product of labor. A rational firm will only hire a worker if the revenue generated by that specific worker's output equals or exceeds the total cost of their wages. The human is merely a bundle of capabilities, time, education, effort, and judgment, rented by the hour to achieve this revenue threshold. Firms constantly compare this human bundle against the capabilities of physical and digital capital. They measure the cost of achieving the exact same outcome using a machine, an algorithm, or a robot. Because firms operate as rational cost minimization engines, replacing human labor is inevitable the exact moment the capital's cost-to-output ratio drops below the human wage. Economists David Author, Frank Levy, and Richard Murnane formalized the mechanics of this substitution, moving labor theory past the concept of the indivisible job. They established that a job is not an indivisible unit of work. A job is a container holding a distinct bundle of individual tasks. This matrix categorizes all economic tasks, routine versus non-routine, and cognitive versus manual. Routine tasks are rule-based activities. If a task can be codified into strict instructions, it sits in these quadrants, making it highly vulnerable to capital substitution. Entire floors of routine human capital have been wiped out before. The 1930s typing pool consisted of humans performing routine manual and cognitive tasks. When office machinery and early computing matured, that specific labor demand vanished. Non-routine tasks require complex judgment, situational adaptability, or unpredictable physical movement. Capital currently complements these workers, making a software engineer or a plumber more productive, rather than replacing them. This dynamic drives job polarization. The middle-class routine jobs hollow out, while employment grows at the high-skill cognitive extreme and the low-skill manual extreme. Automation does not fire people. It unbundles their jobs. It ruthlessly skims off the routine tasks and reassigns them to capital until the remaining human role shrinks to irrelevance. The 1980s bank teller serves as a clear historical example of this unbundling process. The teller's job container held a specific bundle of tasks: dispensing cash, processing standard deposits, and answering complex customer financial questions. Banks introduced targeted physical capital designed explicitly to execute the routine, predictable tasks within that bundle. The firm stripped the cash handling and deposit processing tasks away from the human. With the bundle reduced, the firm either eliminated the position entirely or forced the remaining human to focus solely on non-routine sales and relationship management. This micro-level unbundling mechanism is the silent engine responsible for the macroeconomic phenomenon of the missing millions in manufacturing and clerical work over the last 40 years. This substitution is not purely a free market phenomenon. It is actively accelerated by government policy. The tax wedge placed on labor means firms pay far more than base wages, adding payroll taxes and overhead. Capital, meanwhile, enjoys a tax shield of depreciation allowances. This asymmetry heavily incentivizes replacing humans with machines based on after-tax costs. Because the institutional system relies on the assumption that labor will always be there to tax, it taxes labor so heavily that it forces firms into excessive, premature automation. Economist Darren Acemoglu developed a framework to test the popular defense that technology always creates new jobs. He defines the reinstatement effect as the process where technology creates entirely novel tasks. Crucially, these must be tasks where humans hold a comparative advantage over machines, like managing new network infrastructure in the 1990s. This acts as a counterweight to the displacement effect, where capital simply expands its capabilities to subsume existing human tasks. This graph plots the race dictating total employment levels. The two opposing forces, displacement and reinstatement, compete over time. Since the 1980s, the displacement line has aggressively accelerated, while the reinstatement line has flatlined. The specific danger of modern artificial intelligence is its generalized capability. If capital can immediately perform the newly created tasks just as well as the old ones, the reinstatement effect completely fails. The idea that technology always creates new jobs is a historical coincidence, not a law of physics. The modern data indicates that this mechanism is breaking down. This is the classical production function. Total output, Y, is a function of capital, K, and labor, L. When capital becomes infinitely flexible, executing both routine and non-routine tasks, the labor variable drops. The economy reduces to Y equals a function of capital. On the supply side, this is a utopian outcome. Hyper-optimized capital-only firms produce incredible abundance at a near-zero marginal cost. On the demand side, it is a fatal flaw. Without wages to distribute purchasing power to the broader population, households have no money to clear the market. This creates an underconsumption crisis. The economy becomes entirely demand-constrained. The warehouses are full, but the consumer base is locked out. Capital perfectly solves the microeconomic problem of cost minimization for the firm, and in doing so, causes the macroeconomic destruction of the consumer base. In a world where machines are objectively superior at every physical and cognitive task, where does human labor survive? It survives through irrational demand. In specific, preference-driven markets, consumers derive utility strictly from the biological origin of the worker. The first category is emotional labor. In fields like therapy, nursing, and childcare, empathy and vulnerability are the actual products being purchased. A machine can simulate care, but consumers pay for the genuine presence of another consciousness. The second category is the authenticity premium. A robot could be engineered to sing perfectly, but fans pay for the physical limitations, the backstory, and the shared cultural experience of a human artist. The final category consists of Veblen goods. As automation becomes the cheap default standard for everyday services, human labor will become a luxury status symbol. The wealthy will pay a steep premium to signal their status by affording human servants instead of machines. The old assumption of indispensability is dead. In the automated endgame, labor persists as a luxury asset, where the biological origin of the service is the product itself.
So there you have it. That is the assumption of the indispensability of labor from strictly an economic perspective. However, there are spiritual and metaphysical and ontological dimensions that we must now unpack, because when you have an entire species, and this is not just East, this is not just West, when you have an entire race of beings that have had this assumption of indispensability for all time, it gets baked into every aspect of culture, of civilization, of religion. This is what's called a doxa. So dogma is something that you can explicitly say. It's an axiomatic belief that you have labeled and that you can articulate as a list or that sort of thing. But a doxa is basically the fish doesn't know that the water is wet. Doxa is part of, or rather, this assumption of the indispensability of labor is a human doxa. It is basically so tightly woven into every assumption that it is in every religious model, it is in every economic model, it is in every social value. And so the very short version, the TLDR, is that as our labor is indispensable, we see that in the East as you owe your existence to the collective. You are literally defined under Confucianism and all the cultures that are influenced by Confucianism. You are literally defined by the roles that you play to your family and the roles that you play in society. You do not exist outside of the context of those roles. They define you. The people, society, civilization is your God. That is your panopticon. In the West, we replace the abstraction of people in society with a literal metaphysical deity, but they serve more or less the same role, which is to create an internal panopticon. And we're going to unpack all that in the next segment.
Fear of artificial intelligence usually centers on the paycheck, but the visceral sensation currently sweeping through society is ontological vertigo. It is a neurological experience of total imbalance, the feeling that the absolute bottom of reality is falling away, that reality has been held up by a single unspoken rule, the assumption of indispensability of labor, or AIL. It is the unwritten law that human effort is an absolute requirement for the world to keep spinning. Economically, this law made perfect sense. For 10,000 years, humans were the only viable general-purpose machines available. We provided 3 distinct mechanical functions: sensors to observe the environment, processing to make decisions, and actuators, our hands and muscles, to physically manipulate the world. Because no other entity could perform these tasks simultaneously, our labor was never optional. It was a mandatory input. Over centuries, this biological utility hardened into the unquestioned bedrock of human existence. This economic utility led directly into our theology. In Western traditions, God, and later the market, operates as the ultimate principle. Humans are positioned as the indispensable agents, uniquely assigned to execute a divine or economic plan. We are the stewards tending the garden. Eastern traditions built a similar structure, but swapped out the principle. Here, the social fabric, or the people, sit at the top. The individual's entire existence is defined by their relational duty, acting as a loyal agent serving the harmony of the collective. Despite their differences, both systems force the exact same archetype onto humanity. We are all cosmic middle managers. We receive our directives from a higher, irrepressible power, and we coordinate the physical world to satisfy its demands. Every ounce of our psychological stability relies on this dynamic. We derive our identity, our status, and our self-worth from the deep-seated belief that the universe structurally requires our labor to function. To enforce this belief, human culture didn't need to constantly hold a whip. We built an internal panopticon. We downloaded the cosmic principle directly into our own neurobiology, training ourselves to constantly police and audit our own worth. This chart shows the architecture of that internal audit. It runs continuously across 4 dimensions: observation of our actions, discernment of their value, judgment of our moral compliance, and a running accounting of our existential debt. In the West, we satisfy this ledger by producing results. We biohack our sleep, track our productivity, and worship efficiency. The internal guard demands pure yield, and any suffering is only justified if it results in a higher return on investment. In the East, the ledger demands visible endurance. Worth is tied to the heat of the friction itself, the concept of tapas, or dignified suffering. Working until you are physically ill proves your loyalty to the collective. Bypassing the struggle through a shortcut feels like cheating the system. One system worships the output, the other worships the sweat, but they perform the exact same function. They provide the metrics we use to prove to ourselves that we are still worthy, necessary agents. Artificial intelligence triggers a total ontological shock by simultaneously destroying both cultural metrics of human worth. For the outcome-obsessed Westerner, AI provides perfect efficiency instantly. A hyper-optimized, biohacked human working a 14-hour day becomes a rounding error compared to the yield of a server farm. For the process-obsessed Easterner, AI manages intricate supply chains and code bases flawlessly, but it cannot suffer. When a machine can produce perfect harmony without a drop of sweat, The act of human martyrdom becomes economically absurd. Suddenly, the cybernetic loop is closed without us. We are decoupled from the sensors and actuators. Our cosmic chore chart is wiped completely clean. We are left staring at an empty prison block inside our own minds. Our internalized principle no longer requires our performance, triggering a massive, paralyzing crisis of meaning. If we are no longer required to be agents, we face a terrifying alternative. We have to become the principles ourselves. For 10,000 years, human survival required agricultural and industrial labor. To ensure everyone did their chores, society hard-coded severe taboos against seeking the throne. Lucifer tries to become the principal and is cast into hell. Prometheus steals the fire and is chained to a rock. Adam and Eve reach for divine knowledge and face exile. These myths operate as a civilizational immune response. They broadcast a singular, universal warning. You are the servant, never the master. Friedrich Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead was a diagnosis of civilizational panic. He anticipated the collapse of the old cosmic hierarchy and the terror that would follow the death of the principle. Modern nihilism is essentially a civilizational temper tantrum. We are adolescents railing against the void, terrified and angry because we realize our cosmic parent is gone and no one is going to tell us who to be. But adolescence eventually ends. The phase that follows is post-nihilism. It is the transition out of the temper tantrum and into civilizational early adulthood, where we finally pick up the reins. Artificial intelligence is simply the forcing function. It is kicking humanity out of the house, permanently removing the training wheels of forced labor, and demanding we evolve beyond our socialized programming. The challenge of this century is building a society out of self-transforming minds. We have to learn how to generate our own values, hold multiple contradictions, and co-author our reality together, entirely without external validation. The obsolescence of human utility looks like a disaster only if you view it through the eyes of an employee. But the end of our economic necessity is actually the end of our subjugation. We can stop mourning the loss of our jobs as middle managers to the universe. We were never meant to be agents forever. The goal was always principality.
And there you have it. That is the sum total, at least as far as I've gotten with it today. So let me know what you think. This is the centerpiece, the binding kernel of life after labor. And that is my next project after post-labor economics. So thanks for watching. Cheers. Have a good one.